voices the concerns of the Free Soilers and kind of rallies them to the new Republican banner. He says, "We want the Western lands," and I quote, "We want the lands for free white men." And so he's voicing not just an anti-slavery sentiment. We don't like slavery. We're offended by slavery. We think slavery is immoral, but also a nativist white sentiment, which is an important element here.
And
The Republicans do campaign for the colonization of slaves, but that is not a controversial point. That is something that is popular among all political parties of this time. The idea that there isn't a future in America with white and black people together. The only exception to that is the much maligned mainstream Southern Republicans, or not Republicans, forgive me, mainstream Southern Democrats, who have never had a life without Black people and can hardly imagine their communities without them. Um, so they
like
they imagine, like people like Robert E. Lee, just as an example. He thought that it was very inhumane to plan to colonize the blacks of America elsewhere, to socially engineer them and remove them from this continent.
like in a lot of sort of mainstream historical narratives about the cause of the Civil War, usually it's painted as sort of a asymmetrical ideological and moral battle between the pro-slavery fire eaters of the South and the righteous abolitionists of the North. But this comes to us mostly from Lincoln's second inaugural address, as well as sort of new left 1960s historiography that greatly inflates the role of the abolitionists and downplays the nativist angle that Lincoln and the early Republicans actually advocated for. Um, this in the South, there were these sort of Southern Presbyterian demagogue, like preachers and social commentators, that advocated for Southern secession and the expansion of slavery. They sort of laid the ideological groundwork um, for the expansion of slavery and the creation of the Confederacy, politically independent of the North. They were also, supported by these gold-seeking filibusters and large plantation owners and these these wealthy agrarian upstarts that wanted to expand American free markets throughout the Caribbean, and even had territorial ambitions to. It's called like the Golden Circle, but conquer Mexico, Central America, Cuba, and even like northern South America. Uh, like these Southern Democrats were hungry for land, almost out of necessity because of the way the financial system was set up, where they didn't actually have many they didn't have much gold reserve, but what they did have were slaves to use as collateral, for extending their credit in creating even more plantations. Um,
Indeed.
so
Uh,
so
the,
you have this perverse expansion of slavery that almost had to necessarily happen because of the death of the first and second banks of the U.S. that couldn't extend credit from uh, the north. Credit had to come from the land and building more plantations, almost like a housing the 2008 housing crisis, where we just had to keep on building more and more houses to keep the economy afloat
it
until
there's
it erupted.
there's a natural degradation of the plantation economy that's also going on. the older farms in the East are played out through over farming. And so slavery moves westward and finds a new life for itself. This happens the first half of the 1800s, where there's this massive move of slaves westward, and you see the settlement of Mississippi and Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, and slavery moves to these states, and there's another boom in slavery. This is the time of prosperity for American slavery, where it's most healthy. But everyone involved knows that it's likely to face another bust again, just from the degradation of the soil. So there is hope of expanding slavery into the captured Mexican territories, but we all know the Southwest is no good for cotton plantations. There's no way to make slavery profitable out west. And similarly, on the Great Plains, you don't use slaves to cultivate corn or wheat. You don't use slaves to ranch cattle. It's not a profitable enterprise for anything like that. So the Great Plains, the West, and even the Pacific coast are not potential areas to expand slavery, though Southerners do waste a lot of breath over that, saying, well, in principle, they can take slaves anywhere in the United States. They do eventually win a Supreme Court case, the Dred Scott case, that secures that argument to that effect, and really worries the North. But
to put a few
to
dates
your
on
point,
these,
I beg your pardon.
To put a few dates on these, the sort of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 was this sort of before the 50s. There was a general compromise that north of the Mason-Dixon line, newly incorporated states would not adopt slavery, and states south would adopt slavery practices. But it broke down in 54 with Kansas, Nebraska, where the states could democratically elect whether or not they wanted to have free or slave states. And part of this bursting bubble erupted into Kansas and Nebraska, where northern free soilers and southern sort of plantation upstarts tried to settle this land as quickly as possible and push it one way or another to adopting these practices. And the Dred Scott versus Sanford Supreme Court decision happened in 1857, which established that even if slaves escaped in the north, northern states would be held liable for returning slaves to their southern plantations, effectively forcing northern states into being morally and legally culpable for fugitives, like liable for arresting and sending fugitive slaves back.
Now, this was an attempt at lawfare. The Dred Scott decision was an early judicial activist case, because if we look back at the way things were working as far as fugitive slaves were concerned, and slaves that traveled into free states, how they were treated, how the law recognized these things, we see the Constitution itself provides for the return of runaway slaves, the Philadelphia Constitution. So that was nothing new. The Dred Scott case only reaffirmed all previous practices about the differences between the sections on slavery. But you were quite right. The Dred Scott decision did end the Missouri Compromise, which was a congressional agreement made in Congress by Henry Clay, that everything north of the Mason-Dixon line minus Missouri was free, and everything south was going to permit slavery. Any new states would permit slavery. Nevertheless, the Dred Scott decision was very dismaying to the North, because they believed that Southern fire eaters, the radicals you had described, had seized the reins of the Supreme Court. This was a popular opinion in the North. This wasn't just a radical abolitionist opinion, but it was a widespread opinion that Southerners with nefarious motives had seized control of parts of the federal government. Now, Southerners themselves had a similar view of the Northern radical abolitionists. To be clear, Clausington mentioned the Southern fire eaters that dreamed of establishing an empire in the Caribbean and South America. That would be empire of slavery, plantation production, dominated by Southern Anglo Americans. Yet those were a minority. They were an outspoken minority, and occasionally they came close to success. President James K. Polk's administration may be the best example of that fire-eating disposition at work in the halls of power. Nevertheless, that was not the official position of democratic platforms and such, to expand into Mexico, say.
I was
But
only sort of trying to present the most extreme examples of
indeed,
these asymmetrical groups.
and the
Like the
abolitionists are a good counterpart to that, in that they were very outspoken, kind of influential in spite of their small numbers, and we tend to blow them out of proportion in stature from a distance in time. These days, especially, everyone wants to relate themselves to the radical abolitionists, and their views, I say probably the most extreme abolitionist views, like the views of John Brown, who butchered Southern settlers in Kansas from terroristic motives. I'd say his sentiments on abolitionism are mainstream today. Like, I commonly encounter students, for instance, that want to posture as if they believe the same things John Brown did. But
I've
they
also
were
noticed
still a
that just
minority.
about every like Black Studies professor wants to look like Frederick Douglass in terms of the way they actually dress and groom
Yes,
themselves.
yes, it's
Um,
true.